right, so we just wanted to thank you all for being here this morning. My name is Jason Dedrick. I'm a policy analyst in the city manager's office for the city of Eugene. And this event today is sort of a joint effort in terms of the event between the city and the county. And so much of the work that we've been doing over the last 18 months related to looking at our larger system of homelessness and the consultant report that was done has been about sort of the city, the county, and our service providers. And today is really, and tomorrow is really about bringing this out into the community, having you all become part of our next step. So I've been saying to pretty much anyone who will listen that I believe that in the future we're going to look back at 2019 as the year that things changed in terms of our work around homelessness in our county and in our communities. So I'm hoping that today, with the work that we're going to initiate today and conclude tomorrow, that we will be kicking off really that change that we can look for in all of our work.
Very good. My name is Bob Cerince. I also work for Lane County Health and Human Services, and I'm a new supervisor working with Steve Manella in Human Services. I'm very happy to be here. Just a quick note about being here. I'm very new to Oregon. I just moved here in late June, and I'll have to tell you that my experience of Oregonians is not what I anticipated. People said they don't like Californians, and I found people have been really, really nice. And so I'm wondering, like, what's wrong with folks here? The customer service is amazing. People talk to you. So I thank you for the welcome that I've received so far. I also want to call out several people who have helped make these next 2 days possible. I'm kind of a big picture person when I think about, solving problems and work. And fortunately, I'm surrounded in my workplace by people who are much more detail-oriented than me. And they do such a great job of helping me fill in the gaps. And I just want to call out some folks who have helped me in the last couple months put this event together. And then I'll talk with you a little bit about sort of the vision for our event the next 2 days. I want to mention a couple of folks, or several folks in my office in Human Services, beginning with Lise Stuart, who manages our homeless management information system, Lynn Oliver, who does all things accounting for us, Amanda Borta, who is everything continuum of care. Many of you work closely with Amanda. Alex Straher, who is also just an amazing person who's just been such a great support to us, and an amazing artist, as many of you might know. Danielle Bautista, who helps us manage our coordinated entry system, and Vanessa Lopez, who is another person who's just brilliant and such a great asset to our team. And we've also invited and you've heard already from Sarah Salisbury, who helps to manage our continuous quality improvement. She's been a terrific person. And then I've invited some other folks who come with this reputation for being terrific facilitators. So from the city of Eugene, we've got Peter Chavon and Jason Dedrick, who you heard from just a moment ago, and Reagan Watches. So can you help me in applauding those folks? Thank you so much. So when I've been talking with the community and our staff and service providers about the feasibility study, also affectionately named the TAC for the organization that helped put that together. Even though there's been a lot of work since that report came out in December of 2018 on that effort, and we've been moving forward, many people that I hear in the community, even staff, are saying, when are we really going to launch this thing? How do we get this thing going? How do we get a sense that the community knows of this work that we're doing? And so in part, this gathering today is meant to be a explicit and formal community event where folks feel like they're a part of that work. And one of the things that Jason mentioned earlier is we intentionally brought together a group of diverse stakeholders. And we did that because we know that in order for a democracy to work, we need to have all the voices in the community represented. Sometimes those voices passionately disagree with each other. Sometimes they have a very divergent way of expressing their view, and in our current context, there's been a lot of, how shall we say, hostility. And so our hope in this gathering today, and the metaphor that I would like you to capture, is this road that we're on together. And on that road, there are different lanes. And you may occupy one of those lanes that feels somewhat at odds with others in the lane. And I want to encourage you to consider, we're trying to build this effort where we move together. So in that spirit, when you hear people who disagree with you today, when you hear people who don't subscribe to the party line, whatever that is, I really want to encourage you to think about the person behind that comment and acknowledge their dignity as a human being and respect where that person is coming from. And in that way, hopefully, we can move to this place where as a community we have a common vision. So that's not to say that we are going to adopt the same language and have the same values. On the other hand, I want to suggest to you that our purpose, in part, is shared knowledge. That as a community, if we have a shared understanding, if we have a framework from which we can approach this very difficult problem, then we're more likely to succeed. So those are a couple things I would like you to consider in this time together, and to be open to that dissenting voice, and also look for the places where we can find common ground. What else do I need to say about that? I think that's enough. Some of you might know I was a preacher in my former life, so pardon me for that moment. So now I'm going to invite Peter Siobhan to come forward. He's going to lead us through an activity that's going to help us to some degree to figure out why did we show up today. So Peter, thanks for leading us.
I'm not really a podium talker, nor a microphone wielder.
You got to bring this with you. Put that in your pocket.
So we'll see how this goes. Thank you all for being here. It's pretty exciting for me. So I work for the City of Eugene. My main job with the City of Eugene is managing Peterson Barn Community Center, a community center in West Eugene. And that operates out of the Recreation Division. I've been on a special assignment at the City Manager's Office for the last 6 or 7 months working on homelessness, first with the TAC report and now various and sundry other things. And I tell you that because my priority, my values, the way I think about solving any really difficult problem is to build community. And the way we build community is to develop relationships. And so we're going to do a little bit of that first thing, taking to heart Sarah's encouragement to get up and move around and take care of yourself. So what I'd like for folks to do is to stand up at their table and push the chairs in. That's the first step. You're lucky there's so many tables in here. I had a whole different way of doing this that might have been scarier. All right, so we're going to do an activity called Fill the Space. And in this activity, you're going to alternate between walking around and reflecting on prompts that I give you. And then I'll ask you to, and as you're walking around, try and not connect with anybody in the room. Just ground yourself in the prompt, think about what the question's asking you, and figure out what your answer is. After a period of time, I'm going to ask you to raise your head and make eye contact with someone. And as you make eye contact with that person, share your response to the prompt that I give you. Okay? So, and we're going to fill the space. We've got lots of obstacles in the way, and I know we have at least one wheelchair, and so let's try and be mindful of that. But it's important that you're moving around inside the space. So, for your first prompt, what I'd like for you to do is think about what hopes do you have for the 2 days. So this isn't big picture, we want to end homelessness or whatever, not that big stuff. This is about the 2 days that we're spending here together. I would like for you to get really grounded in what are your hopes for these 2 days, okay? So wander around, think about that, get a good answer, and I'll let you know when to raise your head and make contact with folks. And we'd like to do this in silence until you're sharing. Okay, begin to raise your heads and make eye contact with somebody and share your hopes. All right, folks. Thank you for playing Fill the Space with me and with each other. So I really like this activity, and I start almost every I do a lot of trainings for the city. Almost every training that I do with a variation of this activity, because it really helps ground people in the activities that are going to follow. It reminds folks that they have a responsibility for getting out of the training, or in this case, the community kickoff. They have responsibility for getting out of it what they hope to get out of it. You know, it's a masterfully put together program by Bob and folks at the county, and you know, some of us at the city had a small role in that. But irrespective of how great a job we do putting it together, its success really depends on all of y'all. And so this activity reminds you that you have a responsibility around it. It also helps to surface, you know, we've mentioned that it's a diverse group of people in here, and while we may all be committed to ending homelessness and all of the things that entails, we bring different perspectives to that, and it's important that we have those different perspectives. Nobody's really figured this out to the degree that it needs to be figured out, and so we need some innovative thinking around it. And it reminds us, or it allows us to share with one another what we need in order to get out of the 2 days, and by implication the larger project, from everybody in the room, from our entire community, in order to get that done. And it also reminds us that we can't come to it thinking only from our own perspectives and what I need or what my organization needs, but we have service to give to each other. You know, we think about the homeless as who we serve, but really this is a community issue, and we're serving each other, all of us. And so that's one of the reasons that I really like this activity. So what I'd like to do relatively quickly is hear some of the stuff that came up in your conversations. And so I'll ask for some of the responses people gave to the prompts, and open that up to say, you don't only have to say what your hopes were, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you share somebody else's hopes or needs, don't identify them. We just want to get a sense of what's in the room, so as we move forward and think about steps to take, we know, oh, so I heard that somebody needs this, or I heard that somebody has this to offer. And then we can pursue that in a little more targeted way. So what were some of the hopes for the 2 days that were in the room? Would anybody like to share? Bob.
My name is Tyler. The hope that I had was that we have a vision, like we have the main vision of, you know, ending homelessness, but then we have some smaller visions, like several visions that we can start taking action on, like some plans, and we'll probably have a lot of them, but then even go down to just 2 or 3 that we can start on right after this weekend, that we can start taking action on. And as soon as those actions are taking on, then we can start expanding, you know, the actions that we take. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So tell. You're not just talking to me. Let's talk to the room. So my name is Seth. He answered exactly how I knew he was going to answer, because every single person that I talked to in this group was the exact same hope everyone had, right? So it sounds like everyone's ready for the talk to turn into plans, and then that to turn into action. So that's what I recognized through it, and as soon as he got up, I knew what his answer was already going to be. Sweet, I love it. We're done.
I'm June from Springfield, and I was looking for some connections to help us work on the plans that we already have in Springfield.
Oh,
Hello, I'm Travis at Homes for Good. Aside from having goals when we leave tomorrow, I know a lot of people that I talk to are saying, how can my organization help? How can we leverage the resources available in this room? We have a lot of people from different parts, and who's going to take what steps moving forward, and how do we use all the powers that be in the community to move forward with whatever we decide at the end of these 2 days.
Maybe one more?
Over here. Hi everybody, I'm Tiffany. I'm with the Eugene Area Chamber of Commerce. And something I heard was actual, tangible takeaways. Actual action items that are things everybody in this room could do and take with them and, do. Not just ideas, but action items.
Speaking my language, for sure. Nice. Okay, I wonder if folks would be willing to share what they heard folks needed in order to make these 2 days inspiring.
Decriminalize the homeless status. No tearing up of camps, no arrests, no fines, no harassment, and stop impounding the damn vehicles that people have to live in.
Especially in this freezing weather.
Well, hi, I'm Richard from Eugene and with House Everyone, and I heard that with the lack of federal or state help that we might want to help encourage philanthropy in our communities from different resources and business resources. There was a gentleman in Santa Rosa that I heard on the news that was a developer and had built this and built that around the city and said to himself, now it's time we don't wait for the federal government or the agencies to step in. I'm going to build a day center. I'll build a navigation center. And they show pictures of what he's doing, so I'd like to encourage that.
Thanks, Richard.
So I just wanted to respond to that a little bit. I think I fully agree with that. Like, we need to take action ourselves. From the business community side, we're ready to take action, and there's absolutely a common goal that we share. The business community is lacking workers right now in a lot of areas. I think we can really work together to form some type of job program that's going to allow us to, I own a consulting business. We'd be happy to help with job training. Let's get these people working. So I think we have a common goal, and we both have needs that we want filled, and workers is absolutely one of those in the business community.
Great, thanks.
Can I say something real quick? Okay. I heard that we need different, what we could get out of this weekend is good networking for the different levels of homelessness. It's like a layer cake. It's not just a homeless population or a houseless community. We have, just like a housed population, our houseless population have different needs and different things that need to be addressed. Mental health is a huge part of houselessness. The roots of being homeless fall in trauma. And so we all have trauma. Every single person in this room, housed or not, has trauma. The trauma on the streets magnifies itself every day that you go unprotected and you're very vulnerable. Specifically as a woman, I'm not saying that men are not, because they are. In fact, I talked to someone yesterday who knows that there are housed young kids going around targeting disabled, houseless people and not doing good things. This is a problem that we need to take care of immediately. I mean, there are people with one leg in a wheelchair facing freezing conditions with no place to sleep. This is not okay. So these are the things we need. We need to communicate with each other, and jobs are great, but nobody can hold a job if they can't hold a thought process. It'll just backfire. Like, there's no sense in putting all this money and time and energy into something that's just gonna explode on itself. We need to really think logically and spiritually and take a very holistic approach. This is what I'm hearing when I talk to all the different people. These are the things we need. It's not just like a solve something overnight with jobs, not to disrespect you. You're absolutely right. People need to work, but they can't work if they've been unsheltered for years and years. They have these magnitude of mental health problems now. PTSD tenfolds itself while you're homeless. I mean, I can't even explain to you. And I am a lived experience person. I have been homeless. I am a victim of domestic violence. I have 4 children that we were in and out of homelessness, not because I didn't work. I worked 2 jobs. I have a college degree. The cost of living is ridiculous, and there is no low-income housing. And when you do get into housing, you're just barely gonna be able to breathe because just anything can put you back on the streets again. It's like you don't even want to be like housed because once you're comfortable and then you become uncomfortable again, you reopen a trauma wound. So we have to find solutions that stick. Anyway, that's it.
Maybe let's move to the last question. What can you give to support others' hopes for the 2 days?
This is Mike, I don't hear this end of the room. We haven't heard much from this end of the room.
Chris McAllister with the lived experience. We can give our truth. We can give our ear. We can give time. So many people are dehumanized simply by trying to go through our process. We have providers here, government agencies here. We have peers. Share your story and listen to the truths and build with those truths. Because if we can give and give and give, if it ain't received, we ain't building for anything but what people are given. And it's tone deaf. Thank you.
Different steps.
Hi, I'm Brittany Ring. Someone in the room said that if you have like a bigger personality, I think what they can provide is allowing the people who are maybe more introverted to also have the space to talk. So I also have a big mouth and a big personality. And so I've been trying to make sure to work on that because not everybody in the room feels comfortable like talking, but they also probably have really great ideas.
Thanks, Brittany. Oh, one last one.
Sure. Josh Purvis with the Sunday Interfaith Breakfast at First Christian Church. We regularly provide a hot meal for 200 to 400 people, mostly in-house, every Sunday in downtown Eugene. We have a space that we're opening up to allow service providers to come in, table, and to begin the process of onboarding people who need your services, get into your systems. So we've already reached out to a number of organizations, invited them in. If you're interested in those opportunities, please find me afterwards. And again, we're regularly providing space for people to come in, find temporary shelter, have a hot breakfast. It's a great way to engage people who may need your services. Thank you.
All right, folks, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I think that if we can keep some of the stuff we heard in this large group conversation in mind as we move through the day or the days, we'll be better prepared to reach our aspirations for the 2 days. And, you know, so what I have to offer is a huge heart, a deep commitment to, it sounds silly, but loving people and standing in front of them, being present with folks. I like thinking about systems. I'm kind of creative, have a good sense of humor, and I can dance. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Bob.
Thank you so much, Peter. We are right on track. We're going to take a 5-minute stretch break, and we're going to have you come back in, and we're going to talk about root causes and best practices. So take a quick stretch break, and we'll call you right back. Okay, so we're going to move into our next piece around root causes. If you look into your agenda, we're going to be talking about root causes of homelessness. And a couple of pieces. There is an insert. I put together for you a brief history of homelessness in this country, and at your leisure, you can take a look at that. That in some way informs this discussion. And as Sarah takes you through this, one of the things I want you to consider is that it is our proclivity in American culture. Whenever we think about problems, we tend to focus on the individual. We do that because we have a value in our culture and our history about the place and the role of individual and individual accountability and individual responsibility. The challenge is when we only focus on the individual, we miss the larger context in terms of systems that have an impact on that individual, just as you would look at the cosmos, and if you just look at one piece of that cosmos, our planet, for example, and not consider the larger solar system, the galaxy, the universe, you're missing a piece of that. So part of this discussion that Sarah will now lead us in will help us to give some context that the individual is found in. And I also want to say, I think most of us, I think it would be hard-pressed to find a person who does not believe in the role of individual responsibility and individual accountability. I think we all agree that it is a principle, a value that we share as a community. And I want to encourage you to add to that understanding the role of systems and the complexity of this problem, because it's not just about an individual's circumstance. So with that, Sarah, come on up here.
Good morning again. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about root cause analysis, but like Bob, I kind of want to step back and take a little bit of a look at the bigger picture and where a root cause analysis fits and kind of what it is and what some options are around that. So I have a quick general QI overview, a quality improvement overview, but first I'm wondering how many people are familiar with QI at all, with quality improvement? Oh wow, fantastic. We have a room filled with experts, so this is going to be great. We'll go through this very quickly. So first, in thinking about improvements, we have to have a couple of things just generally. So one is you have to, that's really hard to read, I'm sorry. One, at the top there of this pyramid is you have to have the will to improve. You want to make something better. You want to make a difference. And we have a room full of people that want to make a difference, that want to improve. So done, check, move on. Two, you must have ideas about alternatives to the status quo. Again, I think we have a room filled with people that have some really big ideas, some small ideas, lots and lots of ideas. I have a 7-year-old, and so in that moment, a Dr. Seuss story popped into my head, so you'll want to forgive that for just a second. Then finally, under execution, you must make this real. So thinking about what Seth said and about what Tyrone said is how do we turn our plans into actions and our actions into a reality? So with that, gonna test my PowerPoint knowledge. Okay, so moving from this goal and this idea about how to make things better, what do we actually do? So are people familiar with the model for improvement? The model for improvement. A gentleman by the name of W. Edwards Deming is someone that popularized it. It's been around for a long time. But the model for improvement is really a framework for talking about how to make change. And often QI and model for improvement has been ascribed to the industry and kind of building and technology, but moving it and kind of changing it to more about people and systems, it translates well. There's a couple of adjustments to make, but in terms of the model for improvement, it's 3 questions and then a PDSA cycle or a PDCA cycle, and I'll get into that in just a minute. So the questions, the first one is, what are we trying to accomplish? Right, so we have to have a central goal and a purpose, and it doesn't have to be exact, but like Bob said, like Tyrone said, Seth said, we have to be moving in the same direction. So how good, how much homelessness do we want to end, right? For whom? For our families, for communities, for individuals, for our nation, and by when, right? By now, by tomorrow, by next year. We really need to be thoughtful about how we're thinking about this change and about the way that we conceptualize it together. If you look in your schedules, you'll see that there's time this afternoon to really break down some of these things with your table group. So hopefully this is just something to keep in mind to kind of spark some ideas as you listen to the HSD staff in the remainder of the morning talk about some things. Keep these ideas in the back of your mind. So we're going to set this aim, and an aim is just It's just a target. It's a thing that we're kind to go for, something that we see out in the distance that we're ready to achieve. So that's kind of our first step, is setting this aim. How good, for whom, by when. All right? Next, how are we going to know that this change is an improvement? And that seems kind of obvious, but quality improvement is pretty obvious. It doesn't take a lot of technology. It doesn't take a lot of fancy words. It's really kind of really basic. So how are we going to know that this change is an improvement? Are there certain things that we're going to measure? Are we going to have numbers? Are we going to look at satisfaction scales? Are we going to look at surveys? How are we going to decide that this change has actually made something better, has made an improvement? So moving on, we have the way to kind of, and again, I so apologize. These are not as bright as I want them, but over there, it's outcome measures, process measures, and balancing measures. And then here are the questions that are associated. So where are we going? What are we doing? And what else is happening? So as we think about how do we measure this change, this improvement in the system, we're going to look at the way that we're going to see our results. So that's our outcome measure. And then our process is what steps have we taken along the way to move us toward that goal. So that's our process measures, to make sure that we're staying on target. And then finally, the balancing measures, they're the trickiest of all of the kinds of measures, but they're, I would say, most important, because what they're going to look at is in our attempt, in our aim, in our vision for making things better, in our steps along the way, have we inadvertently done something over here that's made something worse for someone else? So an example could be that if we decided collectively and had the power to funnel $1 billion into homelessness, housing, supports, infrastructure, all those things, what then would happen to our education system if we took $1 billion from somewhere? I'm guessing there would be some unfortunate results in some other part of the system if we just dramatically did this giant shift without paying attention to what's happening elsewhere in the system. So that's kind of an idea about what a process measure could be. Then moving on to developing those changes. So once we have this place that we're going, this way that we're going to talk about how we are going to get there, then what are we going to do to make that improvement? What's action? What's the result? What is the step that we're going to take? And I think that is the thing that everyone is most excited about in terms of the outcome of today, is what are the action steps that we're going to leave here with after these 2 days? And hopefully, I can make that really clear. I'm going to skip through some of this. As we look at the specific tools that you can use to kind of plot your course, per se. So coming back from kind of the global quality improvement idea, this model for improvement, these 3 kind of questions that we want to keep in mind as we think about making improvements, there's 2 tools that I'm going to talk with you today about. One of them is called the 5 Whys. People familiar with the 5 Whys? Okay, a few. And the other one is a fishbone or an Ishikawa diagram. Anyone familiar with that? Excellent, okay. So a couple of folks. So the 5 Whys is very simple. Again, like many of the tools in quality improvement, it's basically asking the question why a series of 5 times. 5 is not a magic number. You might do it 3 times. You might do it 8 times. Again, my 7-year-old. Many of you who've had a small person in your life have heard, why? 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 And finally, you come to this point in this conversation where there's really no other why. That's just it. You have completed a 5 Whys root cause analysis. That's it. That's all there is to it. So these 5 Whys, there's a great example on YouTube, right? YouTube, Pinterest, the place where the best research happens. No? Okay. That I'm going to play for you just to get a different kind of an idea about how this can look. So I'm also, there's an issue with the sound. This has closed captioning, so I'm going to narrate. My apologies. I'm not as good as the speaker initially. Years ago, the stone exterior for the Washington Monument, or the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. was, I'm skipping over this, was too expensive, so park rangers turned to the root cause analysis and started asking why. Why was the stone deteriorating? Well, high-powered sprayers were being used to wash the memorial every 2 weeks. Why were high-powered sprayers needing to be used every 2 weeks? Well, because of bird droppings. So they figured, okay, asking why I stopped. It seemed the cause was found. Workers put nets around the building. They were unsightly and the birds found ways around them. So back to the drawing board of the 5 whys. Why are there so many birds? They come to feed on spiders. Why are there so many spiders? They feed on insects at night. Why are there so many insects? They're attracted to the lights that shine on the memorial at night. So with a new cause found, question stopped, and a plan was created to reduce the amount of time the memorial spent in the spotlight at night. And it worked. The insects were reduced by 90%, and with the root cause removed, the excessive cleaning was no longer needed, and an unexpected benefit was a cost savings realized by using less electricity. This highlights how root cause analysis can involve trial and error, and how the 5 whys isn't always limited to exactly 5 questions. So, really straightforward, really basic. So that's one of the tools this afternoon you might be using, or you might choose to use in terms of thinking about some of the root causes of homelessness. This is a really large, complex problem with many, many factors involved. And we have precious, precious hours to spend together. And what we don't want to do is waste that time spending our energy and our resources looking at the symptoms of the problem. We really want to get down to the underlying causes and have the most impact. So that's the 5 whys. And here is just a quick visual. There you go. Why? 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 Until eventually you really can't ask a why anymore. There's no other explanation. You've likely achieved your root cause analysis. There's a different tool, an additional tool that can be used in conjunction with the 5 whys or separate from the 5 whys, and it's called a fishbone or Ishikawa diagram. Many of you probably don't know this, but I love coffee. I love coffee so very much. So fortunately, someone on the internets has done this. So this is a fishbone for bad coffee. So again, I apologize, the writing is so small, but if you see on the cup, the title is bad coffee. So in your fishbone, which I'm gonna just kind of flash really quick, I have a visual without all of the language. So this is our fishbone for this afternoon that we're gonna be looking at, okay? So in the front there, the head of the fish is the problem statement, and then each of the bones of the fish is a category or area that we're gonna wanna look at in terms of these kind of 5 whys or more root causes. But back to coffee. So examples would be the categories of things. If you have a cup of bad coffee at a restaurant, there's potentially a lot of categories that could fall under. But we've chosen 4, so people, procedures, materials, and equipment. So if you go down that long center spine, from there come these different categories. So if we start with the first one at the top, procedures. So one of the first things is, well, there were too many grounds in the coffee. Well, why was that? Well, there was a wrong size filter. Okay. Another issue around procedures, there was too much water in the coffee. Well, why was that? Nobody was trained properly. Okay. So if we move on to people then, back to this no training issue, the person that served the coffee was apparently rude or unkind, training issue. There was the wrong fee that was charged, again, training issue. But if you look further, the computer wasn't updated. So despite maybe a person having adequate training, despite knowing how many grounds to put in or how much water to use, the computer didn't have the fee right. And so the customer still didn't get the experience of having an entire good cup of coffee. Going back to the bottom under equipment, dirty cups. Coffee wasn't hot enough. Why wasn't the coffee hot enough? The warmer wasn't warming. So you can continue, hopefully you can kind of see how you can just kind of branch out to each of these things until ultimately a couple of things are going to happen. One is there's not going to be another reason why. But the other thing, I think the thing that's really magical about the fishbone is that you're going to start to see patterns emerging. You're going to see the same branches of different categories showing the same kinds of problems. And what that's going to allow you to do is really kind of cluster some of the root causes or put under the same sorts of umbrella the major issues or major areas of homelessness that you and your table group might want to look at in terms of addressing. So I'm going to pull up our own fishbone. So Bob and the team over at HSD have really identified the problem statement that we want to start with this afternoon, which is our system isn't functioning the way we'd hoped. I think there was a lot of good effort, a lot of money, a lot of really smart people, a lot of hard work that went into creating the system that we have now. But it's not working, and there's a variety of reasons for that, and we've chosen these categories. So I think one of the ways to conceptualize this are in terms of the micro, the macro, and then the mezzo. So on the micro level of these problems, the first kind of fishbone that you would have would be individuals. So what are the kinds of areas that can, or the kinds of things that can come up when we're looking at individual responses and individual things within the system around homelessness? And we'll have this up later, so don't worry about that. And then the second is the mezzo, kind of the in-between, the interim sorts of medium-sized areas, and that is our local institutions, which is up on the top, and then underneath, policies and procedures. So again, thinking about those sorts of root causes or symptoms that lead to these root causes around those areas. And then finally, at the macro level, at the state and federal level, what are the things that are contributing to the system that is flawed that we currently have that's resulting in so much homelessness right now? I hope this was a really quick, really big conversation about QI. The great staff of HSD are going to come up and talk a little bit more about some different things they have going on. We're going to break for lunch, and then every table group will have a facilitator, and we all can be moving around, answering questions, helping to kind of guide the conversation and support you in really funneling and honing things down till we can get to some real action areas that we can make a difference on. One last thing I want to share, excuse me, and that is that I think that there's a lot of ways to do QI really, really well. There aren't very many ways at all to do QI badly. One way that you can do QI badly is to jump too quickly to solutions. And this is a really complicated problem, and many of us have personal histories, have personal relationships with this issue, and it's uncomfortable to sit with. It's hard and it's painful to talk about suffering and to see so much happening around us. And so our temptation, naturally, is to leap to the place that's more comfortable, is how can we dig in and fix this? How can we take care of this and solve this? So I caution you to be really courageous and sit with the discomfort of this for a while this afternoon before you start jumping quickly and skipping over the really, really important root causes of why this is happening. All right?
You can leave that up.
Leave it up?
Yes.
Okay.
So on that mark, we're going to adjust our schedule a little bit, in that I want to spend some time with you all on this fishbone. On your tables there is this large paper and markers. We're going to take about 30 minutes for your team at the table to go ahead and work on what you identify as root causes in this framework of the micro, the mezzo, and macro. And then after that, we're going to give you some presentations in terms of what that work looks like in terms of addressing this from our current practices. So can I get someone to turn the lights back on? Yeah, there you go. So one thing that you'll want to, staff is going to walk around and help you all with this if you get stuck. But we're going to need one of you to, with the most creative and artistic handiwork, draw out that fishbone. And then we're just going to let you all get started. Make sure you identify at least 3 or 4 spines on that fishbone, as you can see up here. And we'll come around and assist you with that. But let's go ahead and see what you all come up with. And choose one person at the end that will give a quick report out on what your group came up with. Okay? Here we go. Here's what I'd like. I need a volunteer who can walk this microphone around me, because we're going to hear from the groups. You want to do that, Tiffany? Thank you.
So in the interest of time, we're going to hear from some of the tables, and then if your table feels like there was something that was missed, we'll catch you. But what we're going to do is we're going to take each section individually from the different groups, so we're going to get Tiffany's workout today. So we're going to start with the micro, or the individual, and most of us, I'm sure, I'm guessing, spend a lot of time on that because we have this proclivity to think about the individual, and that's fine. But let's start with that, and we'll have a few tables volunteer, and after those 3 tables volunteer, if you feel like there was something missed, then we'll come and circle back to you. So who wants to start? Okay, we've got this table 1. I'm gonna be the scribe here.
Do you want to stand? Or you just want to sit?
Shit, I got that leg problem.
What was the next one?
Childhood trauma, poverty,
Keep going.
mental health,
I'm gonna abbreviate.
education, family cycles, racism, domestic violence, addiction, emergency catastrophes, like losing your job, lack of opportunities, and not enough love.
All right, next table.
Different levels of personal resilience, luck, stigma and felt shame.
Lived experience voice not heard or even present by the time it works through macro and meso. Agency turnover. Need-based. What's our support word for need-based? The staff have burnout. The lowest paid people deal with the highest need people when they're trying to help them out. Access to training, both to the workforce and individuals who want to shore up the skills that they need to get better at, that they identify while being in the field.
Yeah, so we said sometimes people and individuals aren't seen as assets, valuable assets.
Hand right next to you looks like Alex.
We put the meritocratic facade, so the facade that some people are deserving and some are undeserving, as well as you will get, if you work hard, you will get what you deserve. That's why it's a facade.
Very true.
So our table came up with a few, understanding all populations, a true understanding of why the person is in the situation from an individual level. Lack of compassion from people outside of this. What's this one? Fear, anxiety to situations they don't understand. And one of the ones at the table too that was brought up was a right to housing.
Learned helplessness. And tagging on what they said, just simply desperation.
All right, did we capture the essence of the micro? Sounds like it. The next section we're going to move to is the meso. This is a little harder. We're pretty caught up in this binary world, right? The binary thinking. We got that from Plato way back, right? So it's still with us. So sometimes thinking about that intermediary, and to me what this means is really about what's happening locally, regionally, in terms of, well, we'll see what you all say. I'll stop. Okay, who wants to go first? Let's go to the back, because I feel like we didn't hear from the very back table. Let's start from the table in the very far back.
I'm coming back to you, Heather. Who wants to talk? Oh, here you go.
We have local housing systems with zoning issues and land use, convoluted social service systems, lack of coordinated care and collaboration, unequal access to pre-kindergarten, and lack of access to affordable childcare.
Those are great.
Again, lack of urgency, stereotypical thinking, and What was the other one? Oh, and NIMBY and not, and what is that? Oh, and not informed people.
I'm gonna add one that came from our table. We talked about the fact that sometimes the perceived need is different than the community expectation of the need. Does that make sense?
Sure, we had the criminalization of homelessness, including pounding vehicles, et cetera, that people live in. Local policies preventing Good Samaritanism, and maybe preventing local solutions like tiny houses, lack of affordable housing, which included a whole lot of things, mobile home barriers, urban growth boundaries, and poor, misguided, or lack of housing market regulation, and community buy-in.
Our educational systems and how they're run, our healthcare systems, our judicial systems, they're slow, arbitrary, and circumstances, and then there are penal systems. Oh, our economic system as well.
You ready, Bob?
Okay, next.
Just a few more, hopefully not to be redundant. Uncoordinated service delivery, requiring people who use services to skip around town and manage accessing services across different areas of the community, as well as trying to balance multiple jobs. Onerous cost restrictions to build affordable housing, and that's affordable housing, not subsidized housing. Barriers to employment, particularly thinking about criminal records, and the failure to enforce basic standards of public behavior.
June.
We talked about the lack of coordination between agencies delivering services, but also lack of conversation between those agencies and other community groups like business community groups, to get some clarity about whose job it is and what are different solutions and roles.
Perfect. Let's come to the front, table 2, and then we'll work our way back.
I think the only thing that we haven't talked about that we've talked about was rigid employment models. And, well, we talked about it in regards to employment, but also other things, just trying to fit people sort of into our boxes of life that we expect them to fit into, and not having more flexible models of how people want to live and work.
And this may be individual, but it's institutional as well, the unconscious enabling that is systemic.
Okay, and then let's work back to the middle of the room on this side. Excuse me for pointing.
It's okay. It helps me. We talked about a lack of diversity of funding, which leads to kind of a disincentive for collaboration because we're all competing for the same resources as agencies.
What did we miss? Back here?
I think we said this, but I'm not sure because you moved it to individual, but I think it's also a community issue, lack of inclusion of unhoused persons in the conversation.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. That's one of those that can be in a couple of different categories.
Wayne.
Unwillingness or failure to see homelessness as a crisis in this country, equal to or more advanced than that of the Depression.
And then we've got a couple back in the middle.
Start here.
So we talked a little bit about like funding and how the funding kind of prevents service providers from sometimes serving like what the community needs. So if we're operating under FUD funding, There's also a lack of specific or inclusive services here, the lack of collaboration, the way we administer funding, the layers of homelessness, cost of renting, and the rental market.
Yep.
One thing we discussed briefly was lack of access to mental health services and substance abuse treatment services for most people.
One more.
How many detox beds do we have in Lane County?
Not enough. I got the microphone, so I get to say that. Also, one more, I don't know if this is meso, micro, or where this fits, but the entitlement, the idea of being entitled has contributed on both sides.
Systemic inequality.
What do you guys have on macro?
The West Coast, we divided macro into state and federal because we thought it was a very different environment in Oregon versus America as a whole. So in the state, West Coast is expensive, there's not enough housing stock or political will. Then on the federal, it was a whole slew of things, which is HUD definition of homelessness, a benefits cliff. The last one I just want to say is institutionalized sexism and racism. The system is not built for us, and that means like there's no affordable childcare or childcare subsidies because it's not built for women to work or have any sort of help like that.
We talked about that funding often treats the symptoms rather than the root cause, and it's not sustainable, and then the federal disinvestment in housing and homelessness.
With the federal disinvestment, that's also in affordable housing. We used to have lots of affordable housing built with money from the feds. And the other thing is the taxation policy that we have now makes it so the people on the winning end of the taxation issue now have more buying power, and so that means that it artificially increases the cost of both rental and ownership housing.
It's also how the government is using the tax money that they are receiving, where the money is going and how much is going to where and such.
Okay.
So allocation.
David?
I want to mention global migration patterns due to climate and politics and violence. And that implies the military budget that drains all the other budgets.
Again, the entitlement thinking and lack of ethics displayed on from the top on down. So what they do reflects on us.
So back to the profit-driven market or the capitalist society where the individual is not assigned any value, so it's hard to figure out how to invest. And the national political climate that casts a shadow over even what a local community wants to do, and the lack of community where the individual is considered the most important piece to it, but that's the pulling yourself up by your bootstraps model versus a community coming together.
Just a couple thrown out there. This is more kind of a cultural rather than political. Justifying emboldening victim status and popularizing a culture of poverty that sort of inhibits social mobility through personal aspiration.
Trickle down shelter.
Trickle down?
Trickle down sheltering.
Trickle down shelter. You'll have to define that for us later, Chris.
Popularizing culture of poverty.
Popularizing culture of poverty.
We're done.
Could you talk just two sentences, Josh, about what's meant by that, the culturalization of poverty?
Sure. Just a thought that
That's one sentence.
In 2 sentences. That I think we also often demonize or resent aspirational pursuits, whether that's success professionally, towards individual responsibility, maintenance of the family, whatever else it is, and we sort of adopt this stance of victimhood or that or resentment towards those with success or with wealth.
Okay. All right, did we miss the front? Anything else to add? Okay, Kayla?
So I don't know, ooh, this is loud. I don't know if it's meso or macro, but in the funding sources, restabilization for families that have like emergency issues before they become homeless. So we're really focused on the homeless population, but when we don't hit that middle tier and there's no support for them, then they ultimately become homeless because there's no support for their rent or.
That safety net is lacking. Prevention, yes. Back to the middle there.
Sorry, this thing is very strange. I'm not sure what's happening.
There's 2 things I'm not seeing up there, and one is the cost of medical care and resulting bankruptcies for a lot of people who get sick. And then the other is the unethical decision-making of, or deregulation of drug companies who contributed to our current opioid crisis.
Yeah. Oh, you're fine. Diana, coming back to you.
There's also a couple of preservation issues that we haven't talked about. One is that we don't treasure our trailer camps, which provide affordable housing, and that I think would be a state as well as federal. And the other thing is that we seem to think it's okay for people to convert whole houses into motels. You know, the Airbnb craze in our cities now.
Again, an example of how housing is a key root cause or lack of housing. Okay, did we get everything? Looks like it. Josh, you got one more? Man, you got 2 more, all right.
Okay.
This is just, I guess, not the mic.
Okay.
Yes, sir. What's that? Okay. One is sort of a moral relativism, this democratization of values. We don't think what standard appropriate codes of behavior. And then secondly, sort of a leniency towards drug culture. We're very seemingly permissive of drug and alcohol substance abuse and deregulation of drugs without thinking through how it contributes to mental illness and crime rates.
Go ahead, Chris.
Sometimes we focus too much on the barriers of what people have instead of what they should and shouldn't be doing. So instead of treating people where they are, where they can be, maybe understanding why they might be and alcohol, maybe understanding why they might be doing some of the behaviors that they have, and then having that go into play. We also have fixed incomes. We don't have people regulating our housing based off of what people actually have. We have it on that perceived thing. So I just want to make sure. I don't know that we're necessarily being permissive, and sometimes our harm reduction models that actually help carry people through these dark times are what are deemed as consent for bad behaviors, and I think that we really need to have a higher education on that.
So can I add something to that? Because what I had said earlier, I think wanted to kind of clarify, because I think it actually speaks to that. Is when, for example, and this is the example we talked about, is when an individual who's experiencing addiction, to them, the need is not treatment at that moment. The need is they need, shelter, or they need a way to accommodate their addiction. And folks that are housed and don't necessarily understand are trying to give them the wrong solution for the time. Does that make sense? So I think that was kind of what we were talking about, how it's like the mismatch of the need versus what the perceived need is. Yeah.
That goes to, it's easier to go with a knee-jerk reaction than to ask questions, to differentiate addiction, well, that's terrible. I've heard of terrible knee-jerk reactions to finding out what led to that.
Yeah.
Nobody's asking questions.
Right, right.
Yes.
Good people know better.
Okay.
I think we've got a good idea. One of the things I appreciate about the root cause analysis is it helps us to get away from the notion of homelessness as a simple problem. Problems are categorized, or we can see it as a simple problem like baking a cake versus a complicated problem like sending an astronaut to the moon, and a complex problem like homelessness. So in each of those types of problems, the order of magnitude of difficulty in resolving that is commensurate with the understanding of the cause of those problems. So I think one of the things that I was hoping that we would consider is when we have these, I'll say knee-jerk, I'll use your metaphor, reaction to this problem, I think one of the things that we can do as a community is help people understand the complexity of causes of homelessness. And as we begin to sort through what this means, I'm hoping over lunch we'll have an opportunity to talk with folks about, how perhaps this is shaped or gives you new context for understanding what we're talking about over the next day and a half remaining. I'm looking at our time, and we have 10 minutes before lunch. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, until lunch. Yes, 10 minutes until lunch. And so I think what I'm going to do in a little bit here. So we have adjusted our schedule. If you notice your agenda, we're not going to be exactly on form to that, but we'll get back on track. We have some small group work that we're going to do immediately after 4 presentations. You're going to hear from human services staff on major program elements that we manage to address homelessness in our community. And as you're listening to these presentations, we want you to consider where you might be interested in joining folks around a table in more focused conversation. What we're going to do after we hear these 4 presentations is we're going to divide the room. There's a divider that'll separate the room in half. And one of the intentions of this time together was to have community input and also develop community buy-in for what's been recommended through the feasibility study, the TAC recommendations. But we also acknowledge that there may be conversations that may be on the periphery of the TAC recommendations, or maybe in some ways not even completely explicitly related to the TAC. So folks who want to be engaged in that larger or more open-ended conversations, we're going to have an opportunity for you to also work in small groups. And the idea around these small groups after these 4 presentations you hear is to help us get to what Sarah mentioned earlier. How do we acknowledge in terms of an improvement process, how do we acknowledge what it is that we want to move forward? How do we measure that? How do we get forward? How do we make progress on that? So we want you to break into small groups to talk about that. So as you're listening to these presentations, consider that folks who will be divided in this side of the room, they'll be working with staff from Human Services on specific recommendations related to the TAC. And then on the other side of the room, we'll begin that conversation on topics that through more of a consensus process that are generated, and staff from the City of Eugene are going to help you walk through that. So think about that as you listen. So this afternoon, we're going to begin with presentations around major programs that we manage, primarily related to the Continuum of Care program through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And for those of you who don't know, the Continuum of Care, or COC, is the national effort to address on a regional basis how communities try to solve and end homelessness. And there is about almost $4 million that's been allocated annually through federal funding to address those causes. And you're going to hear about some major work
that our division helps to manage with all the service providers and the community that are engaged with this today. So even though it might be a little technocratic, we think it's important for the community to have a little bit of understanding about the major components of this work. So you have some ability to provide feedback and also just a better understanding of it, how it all fits together. So you're going to hear from folks talking about our housing solutions, primarily related to rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. These are very explicit housing projects, types that we work with. And then you're also going to hear about the work that we do related to outreach, or at least it's designed to do in terms of outreach. And then you'll hear a presentation related to a system called coordinated entry, and many of you are familiar with that. And then the last, we'll have a presentation on the data that we gather and how that's reported to the community, because it's the primary way for us to collect information about what's going on in our work and also to report out on that work. So you'll hear those 4 presentations. And first up, you'll hear from Amanda Borta. She's a program services coordinator, and she's going to talk with you about our housing innovations as we describe them. And Amanda can give any other introduction to herself that you like. No, you're good.
Hi. Oh, it's different when you get up here and you're like looking at everybody. Okay. So like Bob said, I'm Amanda Borta. I'm a program services coordinator with Lane County. And I get the great pleasure of being right after lunch when everyone's going to give me very tired stares. So get your coffee, wake up a little bit. And I'll also start this by saying that most of you probably already know a lot of this information, but there are a bunch of people in the room who are new to this, or are coming from other backgrounds where maybe you don't work in this every single day and live and breathe these terms. And so we want to sort of make sure that everyone has sort of a baseline understanding of some of these concepts. And so for those of you that already know this, you can just kind of take a little post-lunch nap while I talk. But for the rest of you, hopefully this is helpful to get us started and moving into the afternoon work. Okay, so I'm going to give you the full history of homelessness. No, I won't do that. You already have in your packet sort of a summary of history of homelessness, so I won't get into a little bit of what I was going to do. So I'll just start sort of with our kind of modern mood lighting understanding of homelessness, which kind of starts around the 80s. Prior to that, it was sort of a very different problem that's evolved since about 100 years before that. But starting in 1987, Congress passes the first federal law specifically addressing homelessness. Later, you might have known it as the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, so some of you might be familiar with that. And then for a period of time into the 90s, basically every community, not just community, but all of the agencies that do this work sort of submitted applications to HUD for that funding to end homelessness. And so they all had individual programs that were sort of working separately on their own. And then moving into the 90s, the late 90s and early 2000s, the COC concept was first introduced by HUD, and that really required each community to sort of come together and do a single collaborative application for that funding. And so it wasn't just individual agencies anymore. They're saying, we as a community, and you guys as all different communities, need to come together and do this as regions. And so that sort of brings us to where we are today. From 2009 on, the Hearth Act amends and reauthorized McKinney-Vento Act. And along that came a bunch of changes around the definition of homelessness, definition of chronic homelessness. It also brought increased performance measures and a lot of changes around how we sort of function as a system. So since 2009, we've really been putting some of these things into place, including coordinated entry, changes with HMIS. You'll hear about all those things in a minute from the other folks who are going to talk. But so I wanted to give you a little bit of background about what is a continuum of care. This term gets thrown around a lot in different ways, and I think a lot of people have different understandings of what it means. So it's sort of two things. It's community-wide planning and coordination of programs. So like I said, some of this work is still siloed, but previously each agency just sort of submitted applications for funding to do what they wanted. And there wasn't really a community-wide response around it. So it's community-wide planning on a geographic level. And for us, that's Lane County. So our continuum of care, our geographic area is all of Lane County. It's not just Eugene, Springfield. And then the other thing that it does is, like I said, provides that funding. So for us, that's about $3.7 million now to have programs that help people experiencing homelessness. So what that does is ensures the issue of homelessness is addressed, again, in a coordinated, comprehensive, strategic way. So it involves having a strategic plan around homelessness, and it coordinates the use of those federal funds. And then it really promotes community-wide commitment, like we're all doing today in this room, to the goal of ending homelessness. So under that COC program, that $3.7 million that we have, that funds a variety of different things, mostly permanent housing, so that would be rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So I'll go into a little bit just basics of what those terms mean. The other things that it funds is transitional housing, joint transitional housing, rapid rehousing, which is a new program model. We don't have that here. HMIS, and then coordinated entry, which we'll talk about later. So, what is permanent housing? What does that mean? Obviously, it means housing that's permanent, but what we mean when we use that term under the continuum of care is community-based housing without a designated length of stay. So that means it's indefinite. People can stay there for the duration of their life if they needed to. And that can look a lot of different ways. So that can be site-based, it could be out in the community, scattered site housing in regular rental market, or it could be a part of a building that's designated as PSH units. And it's coupled with individualized support services. And so it's not just the housing, it's also services that go along with that. And then the other general requirement, that the program participant must be on a lease or a sublease. So they're really actively involved with that housing, and they sort of have ownership of that. So the two different types that are under that are permanent supportive housing, and in PSH, both the housing and the services are meant to be permanent. So essentially that means it's long-term housing and supportive services, primarily to assist people that are experiencing homelessness who have a disability, one or more disabilities, who are anticipated to have that disability for a long and continued duration. So they have a disability that will impact their ability to live independently, essentially. And the emphasis in this particular model is on serving and prioritizing those who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And I won't get into the very complicated definition of chronic homelessness that HUD has given us. It's very complicated, but essentially it means that you're homeless for a full year continuous, or an amount of time of episodes that add up to a year. So it's long-term and also people that have a disability. So rapid rehousing is a little bit different than that model in that the housing is meant to be permanent, but the services and the assistance that are associated with it are temporary. So the services and assistance helping people get into that housing will stop at some point. So that can be short-term, up to 3 months of assistance, and it can also be fully up to 24 months. So 24 months is the max for that type of program. And it also includes those supportive services, and it's focused on obtaining and maintaining that stability in housing. For this program model, they don't necessarily have to have a disability. Most people can be served through rapid rehousing. We also locally prioritize this for people who are chronically homeless or really high needs. And rapid rehousing is a little bit more flexible. It's really meant to be what people need, and only what people need. So it's meant to be the minimum amount of assistance that people need to sort of stabilize in housing. So that can include 3 core things. One of those is housing identification. So finding people housing, searching, placing, And then it includes the financial assistance, so getting someone into a unit using a security deposit, rent payments, and ongoing assistance. And then it also includes case management, so that can be budgeting, money management, job search, education, all kinds of things. And again, that can be anywhere from 1 month to 24 months of assistance to help people stabilize. And essentially, this is market rate housing. People are placed into a unit, they sign their own lease, and the assistance stops sort of when they're ready or when they reach that maximum. So those are our two really main housing programs that fall under the continuum of care. And a couple of concepts that we wanted to introduce that these really incorporate. So these are best practices that most of our permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing follow. And so housing first is one of those. Most of you have probably heard that term. And generally what that means is that housing is the first thing that we need to work on before we're working on all these other things that people might have going on. So those are the things we talked about earlier: mental health, substance use, a whole wide range of needs. And it basically is the premise that people are ready for housing, that everybody's ready. They don't need to take additional steps before they get into housing, that everyone's sort of ready for that. And it really focuses on consumer choice and self-determination. So it means it's the philosophy that clients should have a choice in the type of housing and services they receive, and the extent to which they get that assistance. It really has a recovery orientation, and it focuses on overall recovery and well-being, and harm reduction, which I'll talk about in a second. And again, it just has individualized support, and so provided with a range of support options, so not one fits all package of assistance that everybody needs, but really tailored to an individual and what they might present with and what they're sort of asking for. And then the other piece of this is having social and community integration, so making sure that your housing is separate from those supports, so not following through with case plans doesn't impact your ability to stay in your housing. People aren't falling out of their housing for things like that, that are sort of separate and really fall under that support piece. So harm reduction, that was mentioned earlier. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about harm reduction and what that is. And so this is another approach to, or philosophy around how we serve people. And its behavior is aimed at reducing the harm of a potential activity. And this mostly is used to talk about substance use and people using substances in programs. And it's sort of looked at as an alternative to sort of the abstinence model, where everyone should stop using completely and then be successful in housing. And this is really the belief that those who participate in those high-risk behaviors deserve education on ways to protect themselves, and a philosophy that recognizes the resilience in individuals. So it sort of follows the stages of change model, if you're familiar with that, that kind of recognizes this cycle of change where people are in contemplation, pre-contemplation, and then they might get into a time when they're stable, and they might relapse, and you understand that that relapse is going to happen, but you're prepared to sort of address it in a specific way, rather than sort of giving a zero-sum option where you're either using or you're not using, and there's no in between. It sort of recognizes that cycle that people might go through, and really giving people ways to protect themselves. So not saying the only way to reduce that harm is by not using. And this can apply to other things, and I think that helps people understand it a little bit better. When you think of things like driving a car, obviously, the best way to reduce any harm could be to not drive a car, right? That would be your abstinence. But other ways are to use a seatbelt. Other ways are to not go over the speed limit, stay on the designated roads. There's a lot of ways you can reduce harm associated with an activity without stopping the activity completely, right? So other permanent housing models that are sort of outside of the continuum, that includes housing choice vouchers, Section 8, other voucher programs. Those are also sort of part of our system, and those typically involve a subsidy but aren't associated with services. Some people can be connected with community services, and people there may or may not have a disability, but they have priority populations generally that receive preference. So, sorry, I'm going through this really quickly. Permanent housing, why do we do it? We know it works. There's a lot of evidence that shows that it works nationwide, even internationally. It reduces chronic homelessness. Since 2007, nationally, chronic homelessness has been reduced by about 30%. That's based on AHAR data. Of course, some of that changes, fluctuates, that's different based on every community. And it's cost effective. It reduces costs associated with people experiencing homelessness. Shelter is very expensive. It's meant to be an emergency situation. It's not meant to be long-term. When people stay in it for a long time, it ends up being very costly. And then it also reduces costs associated with those sort of emergency services that people engage with. So that could be hospitals, jails, and other types of systems that have really high costs associated, can all be reduced by housing people. And generally retention is high, so people stay in permanent housing. Once they're in housing, yes, some people end up returning back to homelessness. That's part of that system that we need to work on. But generally retention is upwards of 90% across most programs. So once people are housed, we can keep them housed. And then rapid rehousing and affordable housing subsidies have been particularly effective for families. And that ranges across the country, anywhere from 50 to 100% can exit to permanent housing. It's kind of interesting with rapid housing, you can operate it a lot of different ways, and so it's hard to compare across those programs. They range as far as outcomes, but generally very effective for families. And then housing choice vouchers are very effective for families as well. So that was very quick way of going through a lot of things. Does anyone have immediate questions? Are we doing questions?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
Questions or comments?
And a lot of this is
Go ahead in the back.
not new.
I was wondering if you could go back a couple of slides to the one before that. Next one before that. I want the one that talks that way. When you talk about, when you explain that whole slide, and the supportive services are meant to be permanent, and you were talking about it being available to people who are disabled. There's no mention there that those who are disabled who have income, there's an income threshold there that if you aren't very low income at 30% or 50% of the federal poverty level, you don't get COC funded permanent supportive housing, no matter what your disability is. We've had several conversations where more and more people, if you're relying on senior disabled services to provide the designation that you are disabled enough to need services, they'll tell you that we're not qualifying anybody for COC funding for permanent supportive housing unless they need help showering, isn't it, Chris? Showering and toileting. You can have numerous disabilities, but they won't qualify you to get COC funded permanent supportive housing. And they're narrowing it more and more and more, excluding disabled people. So when I hear you say, oh, if you're disabled and you need supportive services, this is who we house with COC money, that is incorrect.
Thanks for sharing some of that. And I think some of that can be things that come across a certain way because we have quite limited PSH resources within our community, extremely limited actually. So there is no income requirement for COC permanent supportive housing. There's no income limit. There's no eligibility criteria that's associated with income. You do have to have a disability. It doesn't distinguish between what type of disability. You have to have a diagnosed disability to get into permanent supportive housing. The thing that makes this challenging, and Danielle's actually going to talk about this in a little bit, she's going to talk about coordinated entry. So we have a coordinated entry system that people need to go through in order to get through these PSH units. So people can't just go directly to this program and sort of sign up for it. And there isn't enough availability for everybody that needs it. So we sort of prioritize people for these units when they become available based on what's called a vulnerability index. And so there's a bunch of criteria that people have to fill out this assessment, and they get a vulnerability level. And so we prioritize based on the highest need and those people get referred to those programs. So certainly not everybody that needs to be served through these programs is able to be. And likewise, people often even need further additional care that PSH can't provide. We're seeing a lot of really high medical needs, people who need assistance with their activities of daily living. And sometimes PSH isn't even that level. They need more nursing care and that type of thing. So there are some gaps within our system. Where not everyone with a disability is certainly being served who needs to be served in the way that they should be. So I certainly hear that frustration. Yeah.
Are the fused individuals going to be prioritized over individuals with disabilities? And if so, won't that clog it up?
So the question was about FUSE, which is basically frequent users of those emergency systems that we talked about. FUSE is another priority, and particular programs have that as part of their eligibility, but they won't necessarily be prioritized above someone. All of those people would also need to have a disability to qualify for permanent supportive housing. So they would be FUSE, and they would have to have a disability. So it wouldn't.
And Danielle will be able to talk about that a little bit more in the upcoming presentation on coordinated entry.
Yeah.
Are these just physical disabilities?
No, these can be developmental disabilities. Physical disability includes substance use, those types of things. Yeah.
And then Chris, and then on the side here.
Chris?
Can we explore just briefly the permanent supportive housing? Because we have housing first, and kind of touch on what Martha says. We have people say, well, we would put you in this housing, except you don't have the pre-existing wraparound services to make this housing first work. And so do we have anything in this presentation to talk about how you guys align supportive services and housing?
I'm not sure I understand the pre-existing supportive service. Sean, did you?
So I think one of the issues is with permanent supportive housing, it says supportive services, but supportive services is not necessarily they're not necessarily behavioral health or physical health or personal care services that most people in the community would think about when they think about supportive services.
Like no to incontinence because they pee the bed, but they have trauma, and so they need the supports and they need this help, but they are rejected from housing first because they pee the bed. Right.
Yes, so I'll say that, like I mentioned, we're finding that some people do need a higher level of care than the case managers of permanent supportive housing are able to provide or have the training to provide. So a couple of things that come out of the TAC recommendations. One is increased best practices and training for our staff. There are certainly imperfections within our models and how these are sort of the definitions of these things. I'm not saying that all of our programs operate under this in a perfect way. It's a work in progress, and some programs have a long way to go in getting to, it's sort of saying you're housing first and then doing it, and there's a big gap in between those two things.
Which is one of the reasons why, after these conversations, we're going to get into more of the details of how do we unpack that and how do we improve that system to address that.
Yeah.
We'll take a couple more questions, and then we're going to move on over here on the side, and then Josh.
Question, if I call something permanent supportive housing, say I'm applying for a grant and they say it's permanent supportive housing, is the assumption is that it's only for people with disabilities?
Yes.
Is that
Under
the definition under the federal law, under the county, and housing?
Yeah, so this is generally the HUD definitions and the definitions that we follow when we're talking within sort of this continuum of care. There are certainly other definitions that could be out there, and there's other permanent housing that doesn't require a disability. But generally, when we're talking about our homeless service system, when we're talking about permanent supportive housing, we would be referring to serving people with disabilities. Yeah.
Last question, and then we're going to move on. Josh.
So two questions we can want to table them for later, understand. One is, how is the county mitigating the cost of building these new units, whether that be how they're acquiring land, or something even more grand if there is actually a housing crisis or a homelessness crisis, working with the state to declare a state of emergency where a lot of the fines or fees associated with building new units could be circumvented. And then the second question would be around the recovery focus, assuming that applies to mental health, addiction, medical care, on forth. Who's at the table discussing that treatment or the recovery in addition to the housing component?
I don't know if you want to answer that first one.
Yeah. So one of the recommendations on the TAC report was related to the development of 350 permanent supportive housing units. Some of that includes the development of new units, and many of you have heard of the new project with Homes for Good. Is our Homes for Good folks here still? There they are. Called the MLK Commons. 51 units that the groundbreaking is actually next month. So that'll be exciting. So one of the things to say about that is some of the resources for that type of development is still yet to be determined. But that is the goal of our community. We have, at the county level and the city of Eugene have all subscribed to yes, this is our goal. How we get there, that still remains to be determined. And the other question related to mental health, is that correct? Or
Ms. Janet, is the recovery orientation, I'm just curious who's at the table as your primary partners to address issues of mental health, addiction, healthcare, so forth, when considering this housing first model?
And I think later I might have Danielle talk about that, because Danielle on our staff is working with various teams that, from a health perspective, are addressing some of those issues. But I'm not the expert in the room, and Danielle certainly isn't the complete expert, but she's got a lot more knowledge than I do, and we can talk about what we're doing. But I think what you're alluding to is there's a level of coordination, and there is a level of input that we need to receive from many sectors in order to address those very complex issues. I'm going to pass on the questions for now, and we're going to move to the next one. Let's give a hand to Amanda. Thank you, Amanda. Okay, let's see if I can do this. So I'm going to talk with you very briefly about outreach. And this presentation, in large part, is adapted from a presentation from outreach workers from San Diego. But I also wanted to give a little context about how my entree into this particular topic. And I'll just bring this up first. But so one of the communities I worked for previously was the city of Long Beach. And the city of Long Beach had a unique designation as its own continuum of care. And in that designation, one of the things we had the luxury of is we had the luxury of a pretty well-coordinated outreach team. And that model was based on local government employees who were outreach workers, as well as members of teams from mental health organizations, from law enforcement, also from public health nurses. And we incorporated what is known as a multidisciplinary approach to outreach. So the framework that I bring to this work is managing the teams that did that outreach in the city of Long Beach in Southern California. And what I discovered in that approach, that multidisciplinary approach, was we were able to help people using that housing first model to go directly from the streets into housing in as rapidly as possible, given that person's situation and their readiness, their willingness, and decision to enter into housing. So what is street outreach? And as a description in front of you describes, it's this face-to-face interaction with unhoused, with folks experiencing homelessness. And it really is that bridge between unstably housed individuals and available services and resources. This is a very brief presentation. So when we think about what street outreach is, you can see the goals that we've talked about. And again, I would also say this is the approach that we use throughout all of our programs, or we intend to use throughout all of our programs, in terms of meeting people where they're at, really a client-based or a participant-based orientation. And in street outreach, it does require, of course, that rapport building, that ability to build a sense of trust with folks. I like to describe a relationship that I developed with a man who'd been living on our church campus. This is in my previous home in Southern California, where on our campus he lived there for about 15 years. He lived in a patio outside of our fellowship hall. And we would tell Mark that when he was ready for assistance, we were happy to work with them. And 3 years ago, based on the years of building a relationship of respect and of understanding. He was ready. He was finally ready. He had come to the place where he believed that there was no hope for him in terms of ever being housed again. He had not only had, he was in recovery, but he had mental health issues. And he had this great fear about what life would be like if he was housed. I can tell you, last month I had a conversation with him. He's been housed directly from the street. He's been housed in the same apartment for the last 3 years. And he still has a sense of gratitude for our congregation's ability to work with him. I use that as an example of the role of outreach in terms of that person-centered approach, that approach that tries to seek the direction and the choice of the individual and treats that person with dignity. So this is just a brief slide in terms of key practices related to housing, related to outreach. And you've heard some of these already that Amanda mentioned. And I'll also say to you that in my experience in the work that we've done, that I helped to conduct not only in Long Beach, but in Orange County and the city of Anaheim, that we made our best work, we had our best results when there was a coordinated approach. We know that one of the areas of growth that we need to do here in Lane County, we need to do a better job of coordinating our work. We have a lot of entities, or several entities, that do street outreach, and we have our separate funding sources, and we're finding ways more and more to collaborate. And what that collaboration enables you to do is it enables you to, one, know on a person basis, on that by name basis, who are the folks that are in the community that you've engaged and have developed rapport, and then those who are willing and interested and ready to be housed. Of course, there's this whole other step once that person is in that place, and we have folks here who could probably speak to that. But developing that rapport and building trust is really one of the first ways to accomplish that. And then the second piece of that, as I mentioned and the slide represents, is a sense of coordination. One of the things that I've heard a lot about in the work that's being done in Eugene and in Lane County is this effort about building rapport, and also about having people with lived experience also engage in that process. So there's a lot of good training and best practices around what we call peer support, who are also involved in that outreach. One thing that I've also had experience with and see as a best practice, and in some ways it might be controversial here in Lane County, is a partnership between law enforcement, mental health, and social work, and social workers, where teams of outreach workers who are law enforcement officials are trained and work regularly with mental health professionals and social work professionals in helping to establish that relationship with folks on the street, getting them to the right services and linking them to housing. And this is just the final slide on that. And basically, what is the impact of street outreach? Some of this is national data in terms of how supportive housing, the housing that Amanda described here, how it helps people to remain stably housed. And in that harm reduction approach, how most tenants in permanent supportive housing, they engage in services voluntarily. And we've already heard about the impacts on the public costs of homelessness when we are able to house people successfully. Very brief presentation. There's much more for us to discuss. I'll give an opportunity for questions, and then we'll move into the next presentation. Thank you. We're going to move on to our next presentation, and we're going to hear from Danielle Bautista, who's also a program services coordinator, and she'll tell you about all of her great work as I open up this presentation for you.
Okay, so I'm Danielle Bautista. I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of Coordinate Entry. There's a lot to it, so I won't be getting into the weeds, but there'll be a workout session on Coordinate Entry if you want to join later. So, Coordinate Entry is a program of services, and it's a program of services that So a little background, so why are we having this conversation? We know that we want Lane County to really be the best place to live, work, and play, and that homelessness impacts our entire community. And that's really telling because of the diverse group here today. So it really impacts our businesses, the individual, of course, our education system, all around the spectrum. And the problem is increasing, and yet we have limited housing options available. So really, we know that a coordinated community effort is going to make us all more successful. So our vision with coordinated entry is that our community has a systemic response that prevents homelessness whenever possible. And if homelessness does occur, that it is rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. We can achieve this by having this community coordinated response that is fair and equal access to services. It is inclusive to everyone in our community. It's person-centered. It is low barrier and easy to navigate. And that we are going to provide services based on someone's needs and prioritize those with the highest needs. So a little bit about what coordinated entry is. So coordinated entry, you can think of it as a process or a system. It's sort of the glue with outreach and what Amanda was talking about with permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing. And it is a place where if someone is experiencing a housing crisis, whether they're currently homeless or they're at risk of homelessness, that we have this crisis response system that can appropriately assess their needs and their strengths and connect them to the right resources, and that we quickly get people into housing. So this is the picture, the diagram here is that there's these, we assess people, and we have a standardized assessment process that really looks at their needs, their barriers to housing, and we don't have, siloed different assessments, but we have a common tool that we use. And then we navigate people. We have to prioritize based on someone's needs, and just a side note is that it's awful that we have to prioritize. I think a lot of us agree that everyone should be in housing who needs it and wants it, and I think that's everyone, but there are limited housing options available. So that is why we have some prioritization that happens. And then we connect people with the housing, the supports they need, whether it's rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing or housing choice voucher or reunited with their family, whatever it might be. So this is a comparison of kind of where we are before coordinated entry and after coordinated entry. And I will say that we're not totally there where we want to meet our vision. We're not there, but we have taken some steps to get there. So before coordinated entry, really what it looked like in the community is an agency or a project, however, a program is asking the question, should we accept this person into our project? Do they meet our criteria? And coordinated entry is moving towards what housing and service assistance strategy among all available is best for this household. So you're shifting the conversation to more of a community strategy. Before it's also more project-centric, and now you're going to make it more person-centric. There's different forms and assessments. That's where you go to this agency for one assessment, and you go to agency B, they have a different assessment, and it's who you know and who knows who to connect people to the right resources, but a well-implemented coordinated entry system, there's a community agreement on how to triage, and it's really low barrier. And then the bottom kind of speaks to that too, that there's this uneven knowledge about what's available versus having a coordinated referral process at the end across your entire geographic area. Okay, so some of the benefits of coordinated entry. So on the client level, it simplifies and expedites access to housing and to services, and it really eliminates that need for clients to individually contact separate providers, among other benefits. For providers, we can reduce some duplicative efforts and really ensure referred clients are screened for eligibility. For the community, coordinated entry really allows for a more complete picture of homelessness and a strategy to address the problem. And so we can see who needs to be served in our community, what are their needs, and what kind of tailored services can we provide to them. So, it's not that hard to see. But you also have this in your packet. This is a little dated, so Technical Assistance Collaborative created this in December 2018 or early this year, so there's been some changes to it, but this is our homeless service system, and there's a lot of roundabouts and kind of different ways to get to it, and that's not really what we want for a coordinated entry system. We want it to be more streamlined, and we're not quite there. But if you want to read this, it starts over there on the left-hand side, and if you are unsheltered or literally homeless, you might go to emergency shelter here, or you might go there. There's not a streamlined system as we would like it to be. If you need prevention or diversion assistance, there's a separate place to go. And coordinated entry is sort of in that middle place. And there's some physical access points where people can get what we call our front door assessment. You might have heard about it, but it's for anyone who is currently homeless, and they can get this assessment. And we have some outreach that is currently doing those assessments, but we're hoping that with TAC we can build more outreach into the coordinated entry system as a whole. And then there's these different housing options that people can go to. The tool that we use for the front door assessment, it's assessing people by vulnerability, and we use the VI SPDAT. And we also look to see how long they've been homeless and what their needs are, and we'll place them when there's an opening. So this is I'm sorry, really quick overview, and I'm a little nervous, so I'm talking really fast, I apologize. But there's a lot of TAC recommendations around coordinated entry, and again, we'll talk about it more if you want to debrief, particularly on how people access the system. Is it working the way we want it to be? If not, how do we get there? And all of that. Anyways.
We're going to go ahead and take some questions and see where you all are at. So, yes, sir.
Well, I don't mean to make you more nervous, but I feel terrible just going after you.
Go for it.
So, you say this isn't what you want, this isn't mainstream like you want. Why? Let's get to the whys. Why? Where's the motivation not to have this mainstream? I've been asking for a while. Okay, I'm a homeless guy. You guys are coming up with a place that I go to. It will be done through coordinated entry. So where do I go get on the list? Well, just about anywhere that you are getting service provided to you. Most places that I would go get service provided to me already know I'm homeless. I don't need to identify, hi, I'm Richard, I'm homeless. If I wasn't homeless, I wouldn't be there. So why are we not motivated to streamline this so this works like it should?
Richard, that's a great question. And I think so not to not answer your question, but I think when we get into the work groups, we can do a great 5 whys for that and get out to what are the root causes of the barriers to getting to that place, because I think there's several. And I don't know if there's a quick answer to that.
But let me add to that, because I know we have we had some elected folks in the room earlier and a representative that. Part of that also is the community giving enough support to our elected officials to make some of these things happen. So it is a democratic society in which we live, and some of that relates to decision-making, especially related to funding. And then also, not only that, but determining where is the funding. And sadly, we don't have enough of it from all kinds of sources.
Blame is elsewhere, it doesn't work with me as far as an answer.
I totally,
as far
yeah.
as why this isn't, that doesn't sit well with me, and passing the buck doesn't work.
I think that comment is well taken, and as a community, we all participate in this system, right? So it's a system that in some way, shape, or form, we all currently support. So this is a question for all of us to answer. And it's a question that in a democratic process occurs through, unfortunately, the reality of a bureaucracy. I see Aaron's hand, and then I'm going to go. Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, it would be helpful for me to also just hear some background on the context of where coordinated entry and Continuum fall in what works and what doesn't and where we need to go. So is coordinated entry to and we're trying to like make it better, or is it actually the way to like address these problems and now we're gonna work within? Do you know what I mean? Like how much of the solution builds on what we're doing and how much of the solution needs to like revamp completely and think about what we're doing? And where does what Lane County is currently doing fit into? I can answer that. Well, it's kind of like getting
Yeah. No, yes, it's a rhetorical question, absolutely. And I think that is the process that we're engaged in. It is a best practice model that's used throughout the country, and especially within the COC quote-unquote program, or some call it the COC franchise, right? So that coordinated entry and all the other programs that we've talked about that have success, there are models for that in other places. And also in these other places where they've seen success, they've also seen that after that success, they can't rest on their laurels. They need to keep revamping and revising the system depending upon the changes. And Salt Lake City is a great example of that. So my response is, we're not there yet. We see coordinated entry as the model that we need to improve, and we've got a long way to go to get there.
Can I answer?
Go ahead.
So, and I would say, I think we do want to get to coordinated entry where, I mean, this vision is coordinated entry, so we want to be person-centered, we want it to be low barrier, and I think we have to incorporate other pieces into coordinated entry. So we have homeless prevention involved, or we have rapid resolution or diversion, and also it means that we have more housing providers involved in coordinated entry. So it really does take a community to make this effective. So I think that's, yes.
Well, this is actually for Bob. We could use a wish list for what you would like to see funded or enabled by government so that we could actually help you get that.
Yeah, I really do think that when you look at what, at least through the work of Lane County elected officials and the city of Eugene, that's where the support is right now. And those recommendations, which you've seen in some format is presented to you in the materials today and what we'll be talking about also, that is the community's response officially and politically. And those, when most people see the TAC recommendations, we'll talk about those after this, they agree, yeah, it makes sense. So that's a good place for you to start with, where can the community support. So on the side here first, and then we're going to go back to the other side. Yes, ma'am. Yes, go ahead.
Coordinated entry, if you go to the HUD website, the definition of coordinated entry is serving the most vulnerable, and HUD has a formal definition of most vulnerable. That means nobody else gets served under that coordinated care entry unless you fit the specific criteria of most vulnerable. And they say what that is. Lane County does not have to use the most vulnerable criteria for their coordinated entry, but they do. And it is specifically it will only allow them to serve the most vulnerable, which is nobody that's at 100% of the federal poverty level can be served by, is not meet the criteria that HUD gives you for coordinated entry and most vulnerable. On the website for Lane County, it says, we use the HUD definition of, quote, most vulnerable. And when you read that in HUD, it limits to the bare minimum so that coordinated entry only serves the bare minimum. I personally fall out in 3 boxes. Even though I'm disabled, and even though I'm a senior, and even though I have all this criteria, and hundreds of people, hundreds, can't touch any services because they don't meet the federal criteria that Lane County is not required to use for most vulnerable. Thank you very much.
Should we respond?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I'll take a stab at it first. In some ways, this is going to sound somewhat cynical. people end up on what's called the central wait list, right? It's a list, if we're going by that definition, and we do use that definition, in some ways you don't want to be on that list because it is the most vulnerable. These are folks who are very likely to die. In fact, there's a notion of trimorbidity where you have 3 factors that determine how likely you are to die on the streets. So there's a reason why HUD has identified folks who are most likely to die on the streets as the ones who we want to focus this limited resource. The reality is we have limited resources. And so the very difficult question that we have to make is, who are we going to serve? It's a community decision that we have to make. And so it's a horrible decision. And the reality is we do not have enough resources today under the HUD definition to serve everyone who is in need in the case of folks who are in this room today. Absolutely. I'm going to go to the side, and then we're going to go back to the middle, and then to the other side. Yes, sir.
So my understanding, when the TAC report first came out, there were many discussions where everybody recognized, well, we don't have enough housing to put people in. We don't have enough shelter beds, and so on. So my understanding is that Richard is on the list somewhere, on the vulnerability scale somewhere in your database, but he hasn't come up because there's enough resources anyway. And that's one of the reasons why you're not out beating the bushes to get everybody in the database. Is that really kind of what it boils down to?
Last year, I think we determined we housed, almost 40 people. We had enough resources to house 40 new additional folks into permanent supportive housing. That's what we had in our inventory to serve. So you can see that in terms of the overall need, many of you are familiar with the results of the point-in-time count. So yes, we have a very limited resource. I interrupted Danielle because Danielle was going to make a comment related to the question earlier.
I would just say to give you the scope of how many people are in need of permanent supportive housing, just on the singles list alone, we have over 100, and another, I think it's 50 or 60 who need rapid rehousing assistance. So it does move slower than we would like, but the idea is that we're prioritizing those who are at risk on the streets now, today. So, and it is challenging.
Yes. Richard.
All right. So I understand your position. I understand limited funding. Counselor Commissioner Sorensen put it well when he said it's pretty much on the shoulders of the local governments. Nothing's coming from above there. But if you don't challenge yourself to open up your criteria screening and go beyond the most vulnerable as far as your definition of who you're going, you got to start somewhere, of course. But if you don't open up and go beyond that, then you are going to run into more most vulnerable on the street. There are 65,000 at last estimate of people that are on the edge, on the precipice of becoming homeless. And 108,000 estimate from PSU in the 3 counties surrounding in Portland. These are people that are ready to fall into the streets, into your coordinated entry system, and they don't want to be, and you don't need all this extra people. So talking about people who are most vulnerable and chronically homeless, yes, we need to do something, but if you don't want a bigger problem, and it's time to get this right the first time by looking at homeless prevention as part of your system, before you do all of this work in vain.
Thank you. On the side there, Chris.
Thank you, Danielle, for the hard work you do with this coordinated entry. I know it's not easy. That said, a lot of the people that I'm helping with have already fallen out of the system. We're part of permanent supportive housing, but for some reason or other have not been able to get back in. And so a lot of the costs that we're seeing that are racked up are people who don't even qualify for a lot of these care because of the fact that their conditions are less across the board, but they're more severe. I got a guy who's lost his toes because he couldn't get into health care now. Then he fell out of permanent supportive housing. He's on the coordinated waiting list, and he's even high at the list. However, people have to die for these openings to open up.
Pretty much.
And so We're waiting for mortality to create openings to prevent mortality, and we're spending money trying to shore this up. And so I know the system's not perfect, but I just want to say thank you for trying. We need something better.
Yeah, it won't work.
And I think one of the things that, not from this area, that I think is unique, at least in my view, is all of the alternative shelter that this community has supported is a measure of how the community is trying to find some way outside of our existing funding streams to meet the need. It's not enough, it's not the ultimate solution, but it's the community's response to this is what we can do right now. And that's why we're all here today, right? We wouldn't be here if we didn't really have some concern about how to get to those solutions. And this is why we also are here to put our heads together on how we move this forward. Was there another comment? Yes.
Elimination of homelessness would not cost a whole lot of money. It's legislative. It wouldn't cost a whole lot of money to make those changes.
We're on the same side, sister. Yes, yes, sir.
No,
Oh, no, we're not?
That's what she's,
Oh,
well,
I
because
feel
you're
like,
sheltered and she's not.
oh, I see. Well, I get it. Yes, Mike.
I was just curious, like for the people that are getting pulled off the centralized wait list, of that, are there any that aren't actually getting placed in permanent supportive housing or rapidly housing? Like, how is the housing shortage and barriers by landlords or housing providers impacting the success of the people that are actually getting pulled off that centralized wait list?
Yeah, so of course, one of the things that if someone's pulled and they have to go in the private market, that there are challenges, and so that's why the services with those programs are so important. So they're going to work with the client to address those barriers. We offer a risk mitigation fund to landlords to try to, if there's to try to incentivize them to work with us and with the clients, so that it does impact that, but we do find a lot of success once they're referred to the housing program, and if they're connected and they have that wraparound services with the client.
Do we have a grasp on the number of people that are actually bouncing back out and not actually securing that permanent supportive housing or housing through rapid rehousing?
Yeah, I can share that with you later. Mm-hmm.
Dan, and then we're going to move on to our last presentation.
Just a quick
Go
comment.
ahead.
The coordinated entry system is really the lifeboat, right? And it seems to me when we focus on it, we're fighting over who gets onto how many people can get onto the lifeboat, rather, and the criteria for who gets onto the lifeboat. What we got to do is build bigger lifeboats, more lifeboats. Right? That's what our focus has to be, or better yet, to keep the ship from sinking.
Yes.
But fighting over the coordinated entry isn't going to solve anything until we get more lifeboats.
Good point. We'll have a lifeboat conversation in short order, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So the last presentation, let's give a hand to Danielle. Thank you, Danielle. And while I pull up this next slide, I just wanted to make the comment that it's very challenging for everyone from wherever you sit and wherever you live to feel incredibly frustrated. And I'm guessing even at times despairing over our current situation. Many folks will talk about the crisis of homelessness from Seattle to San Diego. So in our major metropolitan communities, there's a tremendous amount of suffering going on. And the reason that we are here in this room is because we care, and for some reason, we still have hope that we can do something about it, right? So I don't want to minimize the critique that people have about what we're doing. I want to hear it as real and honest feedback. And at the same time, I also want us to share in this sense that as a community, we have to do whatever we can to try to move this forward, to build those lifeboats, and to improve our system. The folks that I see around this room, these are doers. These are folks who are actively engaged in the problem solving. So I'm grateful for your participation. Our last presentation, let's see, I can do this. I got two mics, look at that. Let me open this. This last presentation is a presentation related to the information. What is the actual quantitative measures that we have to show what we're actually doing related to homelessness in the system that we help to manage through through human services in the county, and how do we tell that story to the community? That's what this next presentation is about. And please welcome Lisa and Melissa. Is Lisa and Melissa?
There she is.
Oh, there you are, Melissa and Lisa.
All right. Hello, we are the data nerds. I'm Melissa Coloma, and I am the HMIS system administrator, so I manage the day-to-day stuff in our system.
And I'm Lisa Stuart, and I'm the analyst, and I do the analytics on the data that comes out the back of the system. So we're the life cycle of the data.
All right, so each Continuum Care is responsible for selecting a homeless management information system software that complies with HUD's data collections, management, and report standards. Lane County uses WellSky Community Services, formerly Service Point. We use the system to collect client-level data and data on housing and services provided to homeless individuals, families, and persons at risk of homelessness or living in poverty. We have 27 Lane County social services providers who participate in our HMIS. 2 providers that aren't up there would be law enforcement and Oregon Department of Human Services. They don't have access to our system. Lane County agencies don't pay an access fee to participate in the system, and also don't have to pay for a license.
That doesn't mean it's free.
That's not free. Our end users, Lane County supports, so far we have licenses for up to 250 users. Currently we have 200 users. Our licensed users range from executive directors, program managers, case managers, intake workers, street outreach, housing providers, and social service workers. These users have collected and entered data into the HMIS for about, at 50,000 people per year. So the projects that we have in the system currently has 170 active projects in the system. The projects range from permanent housing, transitional housing, emergency shelter, alternative camping programs, food pantries and meal sites, case management, in-home parenting support, housing and service navigation, homeless prevention rent assistant, workforce services, community service centers, and homeless day access centers. These projects are public, private, and faith-based. They also serve adults, families, children, elderly, and disabled and ex-offenders. HMIS is the foundation of analytics used to measure strategies and activities the community has implemented to address poverty and homelessness in our county.
All right. Like Danielle said, what we're trying to do with the homeless system and the services that we provide is we want homelessness to be rare, to be brief, and to be one time. So what we do with the data in our system is we can provide the predictive analytics on the strategies that are being implemented. So we know what the baseline is. We know how well we're doing today. So when we implement these strategies, when we talk about adding a emergency shelter or an additional 350 permanent supportive housing beds, we should be able to see a change in the data that we have actually changed how many people have experienced homelessness and that we have made those experiences more brief. So let's take a look at what we can actually take a look at in the system. The homeless system is really tightly defined. So when I'm talking about the homeless system here on these data that I'm going to show you, I am talking only about people who have stayed in emergency shelters, transitional housing, or were formerly homeless and are in the rapid rehousing projects or permanent supportive housing projects that Amanda talked about. I am not talking about the local systems that we have put in place that include sanctioned camps, dusk to dawn, camping, car camping programs. And the reason that these aren't included isn't because they don't have a value. It's that the initiative, the national initiative on looking at measures, matrix that are ending homelessness, don't include them. So they just include this other very tightly defined definition of homeless system, just so you know what is in here and what isn't. So this slide, it's showing the number of households and people that were in the homeless system in federal fiscal year 2018, which is 10/1/2017 to 9/30/2018. Anyway, a year. So 2 years ago. So you can see there's 4,000 people that experienced homelessness. Those 4,000 people were in 3,000 households. That's what that's telling us at the very top. We have 3 goals, and those are the things that we're going to look at to see if we're moving the needle on ending homelessness, because the goal is to end homelessness. That is that's our whole purpose. That's what we're doing here today. So the days homeless, the goal is to decrease the number of days that households were in the homeless system. So when somebody enters the system, they have entered into emergency shelter, transitional housing, or were housed in rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. It is not including those folks who are in a day access center or who are in a sanctioned camp or are not connected with this system, because we can only measure what we know. We can only measure those folks who have something very specific. So we want more people to move through this system quickly. So if they do enter into an emergency shelter, we want to be addressing them immediately and moving them into a permanent housing. So that is what the days homeless is. If the second somebody hits that, either they're diverted from emergency shelter, so we find a way for them to get back to their family or friend support network, or we can move them out of that shelter very quickly into a permanent situation. The next one is exits. We want to increase the number of exits and into a permanent destination. So that is where you ask what you've been doing today. Why do we have so few exits? Why are only 14% of the folks that are in the homeless system exiting to permanent housing? Well, why? Maybe we don't have enough permanent housing. Maybe there's not enough designated housing. Maybe people are competing for the market with the rest of the community, including perhaps college students. And then the final one is the returns. We have a really high percentage of returns to homelessness from people that have been in the homeless system who were housed and then within 6, 12, or 24 months return to homelessness. That is something that we really want to work on reducing, but it also asks the question, why? Why are people who are housed in our system returning to homelessness? And we need to develop models and tenancy support for those folks in housing so they can maintain that housing. So you can drill down. I don't want to I actually would love to get really into the weeds on this stuff because it's kind of like what I do. I'll try to really, really hard to behave myself a little bit on this. What we're measuring on what we're if that's for me, I'm engaged right now. The majority of people who experience homelessness in Lane County are single adults. And that is why the TAC report really focused on single adults. I don't know if you've noticed, but it really is about single adults. We're not looking at youth homelessness. We're not looking at families with children homelessness with the TAC study. And that is because depending on who you are, you experience homelessness very differently. A single adult will experience homelessness differently than a family with children. A woman will. A person with a disability will. So when we're looking at this, we do need to break it down into these subpopulations, because one strategy will not work for every single person experiencing homelessness. I'm working on on it. Even furthermore, there's even more detail that can break it out for you, and I will be providing a link for you after this, so you can take a look at this yourself. And this even breaks it out even more. It shows you, for example, with the children, the child-only households are unaccompanied youth. Youth will generally stay in the homeless system for less than 30 days. And so they are either, they're finding an opportunity for housing, whether it's with safe friends or back in their household of origin, but they are not staying in the homeless system as long, as single adults. Families with children spend even longer in the homeless system, which is kind of concerning because it means that they are homeless longer and are not being exiting into a permanent housing situation. So that is definitely worthy of some investigation. And it also means that the strategy for households with children will be different. Exits from the homeless system, where people are going, you can see that of the single adults, which is the image on the left, 10% exited into housing or a permanent destination, whereas households with children, 35%. So of the folks that we engaged. And of children only, or the unaccompanied youth, 40%. Those are, we really need to increase these numbers just overall. But one of the reasons, the why, is there may not be a resource to accept that household or that individual. There is not a housing opportunity. We have a seriously low vacancy rate in our community, and we have a lot of competition for those units. Those units don't fall frequently within the kind of market range that we're allowed to even support or pay for with our grant dollars. So if somebody were to find a unit but it was too expensive, we can't even help them stay in that place. So we have we can't do this alone. We need developers and investors and all kinds of thinkers to be involved in figuring out where are these resources that people can land. Where will they go?
Child only, is that foster children?
Child only or unaccompanied youth. So a person under 18 years old that presents for an emergency shelter or for transitional housing. Yeah.
So yes.
Some of them could be foster children who left their foster home. They would be unhoused, unsheltered, yeah. A runaway, homeless youth, yeah, thanks, yeah. So we can drill down on this again. This is just another way of looking at those details. So this is, this slide, the little ring at the top shows all the exits from the homeless system. So 14% of households exit to permanent housing. And the orange is to a temporary destination. So temporary destination would be an emergency shelter, transitional housing, staying with friends or family temporarily, that you're not in the lease, you're just being a guest, so to speak. And then 72% are unknown. We do not know where those folks landed. And here's the trend of people exiting. So we kind of, like many trends, we would like it to go up. And you can see that we're not doing that. And again, it is because there are no resources at the end. We can put as many people as we want onto a coordinated entry list, but there has to be a resource for that person from the list to go.
What about like rental agencies and companies that are like capitalizing and marketing and not having housing available even though they're supposed to be low income, and they keep raising your rent, and you're then become someone who is afraid of becoming homeless again because there's no accountability for these rental agencies that are taking over all the apartments but not leaving low income rents available.
At the table earlier this morning, we were talking about the market and housing, and it is governed by the market, by the capitalist market. It is not governed by goodwill. The incentive isn't to That just doesn't exist
It's not
in.
a moral incentive.
It's not, it is, so that is probably a big piece of it
So
is.
what do we do?
That's a good question.
Like,
So
can
we have to
take
do.
out a class action lawsuit on umbrella properties? Let's do it.
I'll let him speak to that.
Come back tomorrow, we'll talk more about
Okay.
There's a hand.
Oh, yeah.
There's a very rich data point that you mentioned about that 14 or 15% that's falling out of housing once it's achieved it. Do you have any other data that drills down as to why they are falling out? You know, are there tenancy supports that we might be focusing on, that we might be looking at resources to direct in that way?
I do not have those data, but that is exactly what we need to do, is to look at these data, and when we implement the tenancy support, which is one of the TAC recommendations, is that we develop and support tenancy support for people who have been in the homeless system and are now housed, to keep them there. So whatever we develop, whatever that strategy is, we want to measure that we are actually having the impact that we thought we were investing in. So we have to keep looking at these things. So thank you for moving us forward on this, because this next slide is about those returns. This is about who returns to homelessness after being housed from the homeless system. So they were entered in the homeless system. The system helped them get into a permanent housing, and then within this slide is about 6 months. But within 6 months, how many people return? This, I think, is actually pretty interesting. We're seeing here that of all the people that were housed, that were single adults, only 7 people returned. So we're thinking, whatever the strategies are that are being implemented for single adults, it is more successful than for the other household types, because they are keeping housing. They're staying in a housing unit. Whereas families with children, which you don't want to see, is 15% within 6 months return to homelessness. So what's going on?
Cost of living. That is true, and cost of living.
Mm-hmm.
And if kids argue, your landlord's on your butt, and then you get an eviction notice.
And the units are generally more expensive, so therefore more difficult to maintain.
I sleep in my living room, and I have for 10 years. So every time I've had housing, my kids always get the bedrooms, you know?
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's not like we have these great spaces.
But you're
where-
still getting 2 bedrooms, so you're paying more for your unit.
Yeah, I'm paying,
Yeah.
yeah. And I'm living in my living room without, like, my sanity, without my space, you know? But I'm giving the doors to the rooms to my kids,
Yeah.
because they're growing and developing. But what I'm saying is, like, all of that chaos from just, like, bringing up kids and everything, there's no, like, it's all meshed together. So then you have, like, arguments arise and this and that, normal stuff for raising kids, and then landlords or managers are like, why is there so much chaos in your house? And you're like, well, because I live in this really small apartment with a family.
Right.
And then we get evicted.
Yeah, so you're more vulnerable with the children in the household, yeah. The child only, again, the unaccompanied youth, this is really high, but generally when a youth is a runaway, they're a runaway again. And this is not an acceptable number, it's something that we want to address, but here it is, this is our baseline right here, this is what we can look at.
So for the adult population, like, is there a distinction to be made here about programs that are caseworker supported versus just like that aren't, when it comes to the distinction between adult and child?
No, there really isn't. So these are folks who were in the homeless system of services, and they were housed either with rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, or perhaps with a voucher, or perhaps they just got into a general market rental. But they did exit the homeless system for stable housing. So they may or may not have ongoing support. Yeah, but that would be an interesting drill down to see if people with the supports, if they fared better than folks that didn't. Go ahead. Person with a baby, please. Okay.
Is there any differences in supports provided to unaccompanied youth who exited the permanent housing versus supports offered to adults?
Unaccompanied youth rarely exit into permanent supportive housing because they rarely can be on a lease.
Well, what I meant is, with this chart that you have
So they're generally, I do know for this population that we're looking at here with these 38 that exited, they usually went back to the family of origin or staying permanently with friends or other family. So it may not have been stable for them. Yeah, but it's generally not permanent supportive housing in that case.
Last one, I swear. Does the evidence support like the idea that if a child or a minor experiencing an episode of homelessness has a higher propensity to become a homeless adult?
That's actually a good question. That we now have data in our system back to 2011 for this particular system, which means that an 18-year-old of today, we will know from 11 years ago in their life what their circumstances were then. I have seen data in there, and this is totally anecdotal, that youth that is homeless today was in a household that experienced homeless when they were a younger person. But we have it, I just have not done that, look into it. It's a good question, though. Yeah, it would be really important for probably the youth programs to understand that. This is just another look at the homeless system. Yeah. So on the returns to homelessness, like I said, we measure it for within 6 months. This is the within 6 months information. Then there's the within 12 months to return. So then we have 12%. And then within 2 years. So these really aren't that different, and kind of would hope that by 2 years this would have dropped significantly down, that people, once they were stabilized. But it isn't working. So again, when we're thinking of strategies for tenancy support, it is not for that first couple months. There has to be some kind of connection with those folks that gives them support into the future, not just having some kind of arbitrary cutoff date. All right, so finally, about actually doing the measuring. So what we're going to be doing, I'm going to be doing this pretty soon. I'm going to be running these data for the last 12 months. These are for 24 months ago, 12 to 24 months ago, that's what these are. And so what we want to do is we want to, first of all, see that this is rare, that we're not seeing 4,000 people entering into the homeless system. And I do want to say that if you do include the alternative shelters, the day access centers, the other types of programs that a person experiencing homelessness would use that is not emergency shelter or transitional, we're looking at 11,000 people a year, not 4. So this is kind of disguising the number. So if you would like to write to HUD and ask them to include day access centers in these formula, that would be really useful because it is a HUD project type, and we could include that and get better data. I've done that already, and it hasn't worked, so that's why I'm asking you. So what we want to do is we want to decrease the number of households and individuals experiencing homeless overall. Didn't work last year. We already know that the data I'm going to pull for last year are going to be higher. So we haven't done that yet. We want to decrease the amount of time somebody spends in our homeless system. So when somebody gets in the homeless system, that we have a response to that gets them into permanent housing. That response is your big ticket item, because now we're talking about actual designated housing for people who've experienced homelessness. And then we want to increase the number of people who leave the homeless system into permanent destinations. And we want to have the kind of support for those folks so we have no returns to homelessness from people that we managed to somehow find a resource to help them get into housing. I don't know if we have time for questions, do we?
We do. Let's take a few questions. Questions?
See, I kind of covered it, so I feel like
So
we're
we're
pretty
going to
good.
go to this side and then to the other side. So Josh?
Yeah, I know I asked you earlier, Bob, about cost, and I just want to reiterate because I don't know if that's going to be covered tomorrow or, but reading the City Labs report on homelessness in San Francisco, their tally was that the city spends about $47,000 a year per homeless person. And thinking about the median wage for San Francisco is $96,000. If I try to scale that for Lane County or Eugene, median wage $47,000. We're looking at, if it's commensurate at all, $21,000 per homeless person that the county, whoever's spending on that individual. Or so, just using that number times the 375, we're looking at $8 million a year for just 375 people to support. And so I guess what I'm really wondering is how, when we're commuting, because this is the home team, right? You're playing for the home field. So we talk about the community at large. We're eventually going to get asked questions about cost, how we're looking at sort of cost effectiveness in terms of whether it's getting people off of more extensive or intensive services into less subsidized situations. Or even just, again, one of the things that Forbes reported in Los Angeles, that each unit of supportive housing costs $500,000. And in San Francisco, it's between $600,000 and $800,000 per unit. And so I guess we're looking at cost effectiveness, thinking about these units we're talking about, what's sort of the strategy, again, mitigating costs so that this becomes an argument to the community that this is a better investment doing this than the other ways.
We have tried to put the dollar value to the impact on the system of services for people who are unhoused, what that costs. And so we do have those data. We can talk and speak to investors about that information. But I think the other piece to not forget is the social cost to an individual or to their community of that person having to experience homelessness, and the trauma that causes to that individual, and the lifetime it takes to deal with that experience as they recover in housing. So I do appreciate that there is a cost analysis that some investors might want, but I think those same investors are also interested that they are protecting the community from that kind of trauma by having those kind of resources available.
Yes.
So I did database work during my career.
Oh.
And so one of the things I really wish that we could access the data navigation screen to form queries, and we can learn more about these populations ourselves, you know. And it doesn't have to reveal personal information.
I'm so glad you said that, because we are actually going to be moving our data aggregated onto a warehouse that we are going to run Tableau public-facing visualizations for the public and for people who are interested in really understanding what is homelessness, what is it for particular populations, what is the trend, so people can get behind the understanding, dig in themselves, because just having somebody tell it to you doesn't mean much if you can't play with the data yourself.
But, my question to you is, as a database administrator, surely you know that the data is never perfect. So how satisfied are you with the completeness of the data? And if we have 11,000 people who use some day services, but you don't have all the necessary details about them to do a vulnerability index or so on. So do you have the data that you need?
Well, I think this community has been kind of outstanding in that the 27 agencies that use the database, that put the data in for 50,000 people a year, and the 50,000 people a year receive, I think it is, I'm going to guess this wrong, it's almost 2 million services a year from these agencies. They do collect those data. They do. It is amazing. Getting that, so those 50,000 records are complete and accurate accountings of, and these, you actually have a couple of the big players here in the room today. They collect those. So we have a high confidence that we understand who is in the system and the populations that are being represented by their demographic. I know, it's pretty exciting. It's very exciting, actually. Yeah.
We'll take one more question, and then we'll begin to wrap up here. Was there another question out there? Yes.
Yes, I wanted to say that the cost, when this gentleman was talking about other communities and their costs, what I think all of us need to really take to heart is when public funds are funding the housing solutions the numerous kinds that we need for the numerous populations and layers of homeless, types of homeless people, is when we're spending public funds at $250,000 per unit to build, and it's public funds, and we really have to all take responsibility for the accountability of how little housing that's providing for what we all now recognize, and we all cannot ignore any longer the crisis of what we're faced with as a community problem here. It's part of it. When you talk about money and housing, how much it costs to build, we can no longer spend public funds at $250,000+ per unit to build little tiny 54-unit complexes that when we have 800 people sleeping on the concrete tonight.
That's right.
Thank you. I want to add to that comment. In my view, this problem has been building for 4 decades, for 40 years. And though we may feel that we have to do something at the local level, we also are all part of a larger economic and political system. And it's critical that we all as individuals participate at every level of that system to impact that. There is a greater ability at higher levels of government to pool resources. I'll say a bad word, a three-letter bad word, taxes, or it's 4 letters.
Yep.
It's 5.
5, sorry. I'm not a data guy, so I don't count very well. Taxes. So this is why we have to have that view, that micro, that macro, that meso and macro will look at how we are involved in the system and the changes that need to occur all the way out. I want to first thank our data folks. I don't know about you all, but I had a pretty energetic morning listening to the conversation, had a wonderful lunch, and then this afternoon, this was tough. This was really, really challenging stuff to hear, and I think it also impacted our energy. I kind of felt like the energy of the room kind of like, and that's natural because of our cycle of energy through the day. But I also think there's a soberness to the conversation, and the data really points to that, does it not? And this is the reason why we need this information. How do we know what we know? And since the Enlightenment, most people around the room have some trust of science and empirical study. So this data also tells another story that augments the story that we've heard today. And it is very challenging. I want to, one, acknowledge that the people in this room, and you represent people outside of this space, represent people who really want to make a difference, who understand the complexity, who in some ways more than others live that complexity and that suffering. And also the sense that we want to be a community that together not only feels that pain, but also wants to be involved in alleviating that pain and coming to solutions. This is a way of saying, please come back tomorrow. I know many of us have other things that are pulling on our attentions and you may not be able to, but if you are, what we're going to do tomorrow, we're going to come back and we're going to work in smaller groups to address not only those elements of the TAC recommendations that have been identified, but also we have a sense that there are other conversations beyond the TAC recommendations that this group would like to engage in. So your facilitators we're going to convene, have a sidebar after you all leave, and we're going to decide how we're going to put those groups together. But know that you need to exercise a little bit of patience with us tomorrow morning as we figure out those groupings, and that you'll have to help us in deciding, what groups do you want to participate in. We really wanted to have folks around tables to have very candid and transparent as well as honest conversations. And that's why you're in tables of 8. And so we want to continue that conversation and then roll up those conversations into a larger group process. So please come back tomorrow. We start again at 9 o'clock. And we'll get going. Is there a question? Yes.
No, I wanted to say one thing.
Okay, go ahead.
So this issue that we're talking about this weekend, it hasn't happened overnight. And I know we want to have the action to take it so that we heal this problem overnight. And it's not going to happen overnight. That's why we're having this conversation. Let's just remember that it didn't happen overnight and it's not going to be fixed overnight. This is something that's going to take time to fix. So right now we're just having a conversation. We're coming up with the vision and the plan to get to where we want to go. Let's just remember that. Let's just take it one day at a time, one breath at a time.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Any other questions?
All right, we're going to systemic inequality down here then.
We have a number of programs that you for a couple of years. The subsidy goes. And it's not ongoing subsidy like Section 8. So that would be
For access subsidies, and it shakes out around the programs.
Why is there a problem? I feel like there's so many, they all have the same, what they share in common is that they are not. Okay, well, as far as institutions go though, when you go into an institution, being a person with a disability, sometimes you don't feel protected, you feel scared.
Bob is trying to make your filming really difficult by changing your life.
keep us on edge.
So again, also I think it's not having an actual voice in the situation, at least that it's not having a real local policy.
I think there should be a little discussion on the individual level in terms of why is our system not working for
You know, like we're dealing with the math and every single person has a rate. Well, what do I do with this person? They're getting out of the hospital at 2 o'clock. I just love that about you.
I want to go back to every part for this one. So people not at the table, public, private. Some people do not, unfortunately, have enough brains to cope with their own health. And do not admit to have a responsibility to care for labor.
Are they going to engage or want to engage with something to do?
So the question then is, why don't we were last minute invites?
Okay. We registered as 5 people, but it's only 1 person out of 5 got their name on the list.